With this being the latest release from Sony, there's a lot of talk about it, about the size, the weight, the 86mm thread, but not enough about how sharp and versatile this lens is, and after using it for a little bit now, I can confirm this is the one. So to tell you a little bit of a backstory about this lens, I actually sold my 35, my 50 and my 24-70 all in replacement to get this. And the main reasons why is, one, a lot of the times I wouldn't use the 35 or 50 when I had my 24-70. From a lot of the work that I've been doing is a lot of run and gun documentary work where I don't have time to be changing lenses, or there's a situation where I do need to be zooming in and out. And of course, when the situations come, I have no choice but to use a zoom lens. Now the 51.2, that was my favorite lens ever. You know, the quality that came out of it, the look, it was, yeah, everything about that lens was perfect. It was a little bit big, but other than that, it was perfect. And it hurt me to get rid of it, but I knew I just wasn't going to be taking it all the time. The past few trips I've gone on recently, when I've been packing my camera bag, I haven't packed that lens just because, one, the size, and two, if I'm only going to use it for a small part, maybe that's an interview or a small bit of B-roll, I can't justify using that. So I had no choice but to part ways. There's no point in sitting in the cupboard and collecting dust when I could get a lens that, for me, it's kind of the perfect lens. So when I saw rumors about this coming out, I was sold instantly, because I knew just from the fact that Canon released theirs years ago, Sony were going to have to take that next step up and make sure theirs is better. And, you know, G-Masters, they don't tend to lack. They're usually up there in the quality. So, yeah.
So there's one shot I really want to get with the plates.
Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect. Easy. And I've been so impressed with this lens that I wanted to put it up against some of the best primes in the range. So I thought I'd rent out these primes to really test out and see if zooms have caught up to the quality of primes. To test the sharpness, the quality, and its overall smooth tight. Whoa. Oh, I didn't even know this button existed. There's like a little smooth to tight button that controls how tight the, oh gosh, how tight the zoom ring is. That is crazy. How didn't I see it before? This is what I mean. They got it right. I'm telling you, it's the one. I would have thought that little button was for, because the lens is so heavy, you know, when you put a lens like this and it starts just to drop down, this doesn't do that. And this is on the smooth setting. If I go tight, obviously it's not going to fall, but that for me is a sign of a really annoying lens. You're doing top-down shots and it starts just zooming in. I'm like, bro, come on, what's going on? But yeah, good lens. So to really test out the sharpness, the quality, the overall look of this lens, I'm going to compare it to the most popular primes. That's the 24 1.4, the 35 1.4, 50 1.2, and the 85 1.4. Now I used to own the 50, the 35, I still own the 24, and I've never owned the 85. I've always seen it as like a pointless lens, not a pointless lens, but for video-centric stuff, I've never really seen the point in it. The kind of bokeh and the great, what's the word I'm looking for? Compression you get, that's what I was looking for. You can kind of get that on a 70 to 200, a 35 to 150. You know, once you start going, especially past 50mm, that blurriness background can come even if you're at f4. So obviously it's going to be better because it's 85 1.4, but I'm rambling. 85 for me just never really appealed to me. Anyway, saying all that, I'm going to compare this lens, and obviously the 24 and 85 aren't the right measurement or aren't right focal length, so I'll just adjust the camera to try and match the look. But yeah, let's test to see how good the quality is. So to make sure this is a completely fair test, I'm going to be using my FX6, so I can use the internal ND filters. So there's no like discrepancies from any filter shifts or any colors like that. There's no glass going to be in front of this lens at all. Also, a lot of the white balance, every other settings will be the same. And I'm going to shoot everything at f2. So I'll do a side-by-side blind test to start off with, but this is the 24mm equivalent. This is the 35. This is the 50. And this is the 85. So it's now been a week since filming most of this video, and I've had about 4 or 5 shoots, so I've got to really test this out and give you actual real world thoughts. And now we'll go through the results before we get into those real world thoughts. So the first one has the prime on the left and the zoom on the right. Now, this one was if anything, the most obvious one, because the prime is obviously 24mm and the zoom is 28mm, so you can see straight away just how wide and like distorted the image is when it is that much wider as a 24. I tried to compensate a little bit with the positioning, but yeah, you can see quite obviously that's 24mm. And when it comes to sharpness, in my opinion, the prime takes the win on this one. Next, we have the 35mm, and this is the first focal length where the lenses match perfectly. So I apologize, I didn't quite sit in exactly the right position, so they look a little bit different, but again, we're trying our best here. In my opinion, the prime looks better. Again, it's kind of becoming a routine here. As normal, primes are sharper than zooms. However, the zoom isn't far off. You can see just a little bit more detail in my opinion, partly because where I'm sat due to the lighting, but in general, especially on my screen, the 35mm prime looks that much better. Now moving on to the 50mm, and yep, same story, different lens. The 50mm 1.2, that's a pretty sharp lens. You can't really beat that. And it was kind of unfair test because that's 1.2, the rest of them are 1.4. This is f2, so this isn't completely fair, but we're just creating here. And yeah, the 50 is one of the sharpest lenses Sony's ever made, so there's no chance the zoom's going to beat this. But it holds its own. It holds its own. And last one is the 85. Now, this is where, in my opinion, it gets interesting. Obviously, again, they're not the same focal length, so we're adjusting in terms of, moving the camera to actually trying to match that, and it's not going to be the same. I apologize, but there's not much I can do. But at 70mm, when you zoom the lens all the way out, in my opinion, and from the two different angles I did, which is why I did a second angle, so I was like, that doesn't look right. The zoom looks sharper than the prime. Maybe on my screen, but the zoom at 70mm, this definitely looks sharper than that 85 prime. And yeah, so wasn't a complete whitewash. 3-1 to the primes, but it held its own. Definitely held its own. Now, what I have noticed, and I'll get into this more when going through the shoots that I went on, as soon as you put this lens to 2.8, it's a beast. Like, this lens can actually compete with any prime that's out there. Like, when this goes from f2 to 2.8, I think that extra little bit of sharpness going up in the aperture, it completely changes the game, because some of the shots I got were ridiculously sharp, I was noticing, when it's at 2.8. At f2, there's a little bit of softness, which is kind of normal, when you're going down to the minimum aperture on a lens. But as soon as you go to f2.8, yeah, that's where this lens is at. We are obviously here talking about this lens, and that's all we're going to do. I'm not using any filters, any ND filters or anything. I'm doing all internal, just so we can have as much of like the actual lens view as possible. I'm not being like altered by any diffusion filters, ND filters, anything like that. We're just going exactly how the lens performs. And of course, one of the big things that people were talking about with this lens is obviously the 86mm thread. Now, I had to admit that is weird. It's massive, like it's huge, but you get used to it. It's just like any other lens. I bought both an 86mm ND filter and an 86 to 82mm step down ring. Wow, if someone doesn't know filmmaking, they would literally think I'm talking absolute gibberish. Anyway, I bought the step down ring as well as the filter to see when I need the filter, can I just use the step down ring? And the step down ring works perfectly. I thought I was gonna have it around the edges, especially being at 28mm, but you can't see it at all. Like, even without the internal stabilization, the crop mode on the FX3, you can't see that outer edge. So yeah, it works fine, whether that's putting a black satin filter on, an ND filter. So the 86mm, it's not a problem. It's nowhere near as big as people are making it out to be. Now, I do have to admit, it is quite heavy. And I think it feels heavier than it is because it's so compact. Because when I compare it to this, the Tamron 35 to 150, this is heavier. This is 1,165 grams, or this much in ounces. And this almost feels heavier at times just because it's so dense. It's shorter, it's not as big. Comparing them, especially when this zooms out, like, this is massive. And I had no problems using, well, I wouldn't say no problems, it's a flipping heavy lens. But if I can get away with using this a lot, then the weight of this is not really that big of a deal. It just adds that extra stabilization. But for me, yes, it's a little heavy, but again, these are just trade-offs to be able to get those f2 and to be able to get the quality looking so good. Like, unfortunately, there are trade-offs, and it's very easy to complain in this day and age, but what can you do? Would I have liked this lens more if it was lighter, a smaller thread size? Of course, but it's not, so I'll just have to deal with it, and that's fine. So like I mentioned earlier, and as you've seen through all the BTS, I've been on quite a few shoots since receiving this lens. I first made this initial video for being like a first impressions, and I realized we don't really need my impressions. There's enough videos out there of people's impressions of the lens. So I thought, why not actually test it out? So I organized one day of shooting. There was 2 different shoots, this at the gym as well as this at the track. And then I did have one more job before Christmas, which is where all of this BTS is from. So I've had a variety of different environments to be able to test this lens at. I've shot in the gym where it was the normal lighting. I've shot at a track at nighttime. I've been outside doing some urban stuff with this fashion sport-ish brand, and then some stuff lit in a studio. So I've got to put this through pretty much every scenario that I would use this in, ish. I'm missing a few, but for the most part, I've got to really test out how this lens perform so I can report back with some real world use cases, or a real world review. Yeah, that sounds better. A real world review. So first things first, now I did mention it earlier in the video about how you get used to it, and you do, but that is the weight. This thing is heavy, and if you're not used to using a lens like this, it is heavy. Now, when I put this on the FX6, it was rigged up and stuff. It felt absolutely fine. It was balanced. It didn't feel like a heavy lens. That is just, my FX6 rig is usually heavier, and I'm used to that. So for that part, it was absolutely fine. It wasn't too heavy. But as soon as I put it on my FX3, that's when I really noticed the weight. Because the FX3 is just a smaller body, there's so much less to hold. I was like, the weight was so front heavy. I was like, wow, this really does feel heavy. On the FX6, it's different because the weight is balanced, the body is heavier, is rigged out, but I don't want to rig out my FX3. I have an FX6 that's rigged out. My FX3 is meant to be a smaller, compact camera I can put on a gimbal. I can just run around and do quick content with. I don't want that to be too heavy. So on the FX3, this isn't my favorite lens, purely because of just the weight balance. It's so front heavy that it makes it a little bit uncomfortable to shoot with. Next is the focal length. This is obviously a 28-70 as opposed to 24-70. I am very used to shooting a lot of content with the 24-70, so there's times where I would go to get wider and I was like, oh, that's it. So that took a little bit of time to adjust with. I still managed to get wide enough shots, and it is fine, like 24-28. It's not really that much of a difference for me. If I do want to go wide, I'll put on my 16-35 that I'm using now. I didn't really find it, oh, I wish I could go that much more wider. It's just how it is. You get used to that kind of thing. But it was an adjustment because I'm so used for years being able to go from 24-70, now going at 28. It just took a tiny bit of adjustments, and yeah, we moved from there.
Being at f2 at 70 is nice. It's nice.
So after putting this lens through its paces, I wouldn't recommend. It's big, it's heavy, it's blurry. I'm joking, of course. Come on, guys. The lens is great. It's not perfect. There is no perfect lens. There's this, take backs, there's things where it's not quite as good as other lenses. But for me, it's the closest to a perfect lens for my situation. For the stuff I do, this lens just works perfectly. It has the focal length that I like to use, 24-70 minus the 4mm on the wide end. But I sold a bunch of my prime lenses and I bought this and the 16-35 Mark II. So I'm kind of set on that. And I witnessed that when I was on my shoot yesterday. I put the 16-35 on the FX3, so as my gimbal camera, and then this is on my FX6, and it worked perfectly. They pair really nicely together. It does exactly what I need it to. So for me, it's a great lens. Yes, it doesn't quite tick all the boxes for the perfect lens, but are we ever going to get that? I'm not sure. Not for a few years anyway. So, yeah, that is the my real world review on the 28-70. For me, as Sony works in a lot of fast-paced environments, I value that ability to zoom in and out rather than that slight quality difference, because I'm still shooting 4K, I'm still using great cameras, the FX3, the FX6, and the zoom lenses aren't bad quality. It's just that whole thing from back in the day when prime lenses were that much different or that much better than zoom lenses. But again, now the technology that's coming out, the new type of glass they're creating, that quality difference, is it really worth it? That's up to you. The real takeaway for me is that this lens strikes a great balance. It's not going to replace every prime, but it gets close enough in most situations. I don't feel like I'm sacrificing anything, and it's exactly what I need for my work. With this one lens, I can go from a wide establishing shot at 28mm, get great looking B-roll at 50mm, and then get those tight details at 70. And we already know these new G Masters feature lightning fast autofocus, great picture quality, and now with that f2, this lens can do it all.